You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
All right, everybody, this is episode 431 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. And as something that's become pretty much an annual tradition here at the Foreign Policy Focus podcast, I have Michael Maharrey on to talk about some very important work that's going on over at the 10th Amendment Center, as well as being the communications director at the 10th Amendment Center. Mike Maharrey hosts several podcasts, including the Schiff Gold report. Those come out on Fridays, and then Thoughts from Maharrey Head. He's constantly writing at the 10th Amendment Center. You could check that out. I know he also does some writing for Schiff's Gold report. And then occasionally I see his work over at the Libertarian Institute, which is where you find this show and all my work. Michael, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Kyle. It is always a pleasure to be on your podcast, talking foreign policy stuff. I like it.
Well, yeah, and it's so important. And, you know, I've done 400 shows now, and it's been a few years that I've been part of the anti-war movement. And it's so hard to make progress against these wars. And I think it's so great that we have the 10th Amendment Center out there that's doing work at a very different level, not focusing on the national politics stage. Even though these wars, you know, foreign policy is pretty much the deep state, the president, the Pentagon bureaucracy that decides, you know, where these wars go on and everything like that. But we can fight back at the state level. And so, you know, we just found out within the past week I guess we really didn't find out anything new from the Afghanistan papers that got dropped by the Washington Post. But it does seem like the deep state, to some extent, found out a little bit. Yeah. I've seen some columns from people who have been overall very supportive of the Afghanistan war, saying that now maybe it's time to end. People who certainly endorsed it at the beginning, who seem to be walking away from it. And, you know, with that momentum, I think it's important that we're firing on all cylinders and fighting these wars at every level possible. And you're talking about doing it at the state level, which I think draws in a lot of right wing, you know, kind of the 10th Amendment, you know, the conservatives, the people, who are principled, Republicans and still actually believe in the Bill of Rights. Remember that there's 10 of those things. Yeah. And that the last one, you know, gives the states a lot of power over the federal government. And, you're looking to exercise that. So, tell us about the project going at the 10th Amendment Center to fight these never ending wars.
Yeah, you know, you mentioned the papers out of the Pentagon. I keep wanting to call them the Pentagon papers, but I guess those are technically the Vietnam. But I mean, basically the same thing, right? And it reminds us, because it's nothing new, especially for any of us that have been paying attention. You mentioned before we were on the air, you know, if you've read Scott Horton's book, Fool's Errand, I mean, this is like, yeah, duh, you know, but it reminds us of a truth that when it comes to war, governments lie. They lie to get us into war. They lie about what's going on during the war. They lie about the reasons for the wars. And so maybe it might be not a bad idea to, you know, exercise some control over these politicians, particularly when you end up in a situation where the president has so much power over decisions of war and peace. And, you know, that was not the vision of the founding generation. They were afraid of putting too much power in the hands of the executive, in the hands of a single individual, because they had experienced kings wanting to make war for their own personal agendas. I mean, you can go back and look at the wars in the 12, 13, 14, 15, 1600s. And, you know, a king gets mad and the next thing you know, he's drug his whole country into war because some other king in some other place insulted him. So they wanted to take that decision-making power and place it in a legislative body where there would be debate, where there would be some deliberation, where there were multiple people that had to agree on the decision before war could be initiated. And so in the Constitution, Congress is supposed to declare war before there are any type of offensive military actions. That's the way the American system was constructed. We haven't seen that happen since World War II. So we have all of these wars that they're lying about constantly that are absolutely and completely unconstitutional. So then that raises the $64,000 question. What do we do about it? Well, we can write our congressman and we can try to elect a president who's going to rein in the warfare state. And I think a lot of people thought maybe Trump would do that, but as it turns out, not really. So we're taking a different approach at the 10th Amendment Center. I mean, what we do is work at the state and local level, and we have discovered that there actually is a way to rein in the warfare state through state action. And I have to really give credit to a state legislator named Pat McGeehan. He's out of West Virginia. One of the few politicians that I actually genuinely trust. He's a Ron Paul guy. He's been around in the legislature for a long time. He's a principled guy. On top of that, he has a little bit of experience, so it's not just some guy that's spouting off the mouth. He was an Air Force intelligence officer. He did tours of duty in, I believe, both Afghanistan and Iraq. So he has some credibility when it comes to this. And since 2016, he's been introducing a bill called Defend the Guard. And we've talked about it before on your show. It's a very simple bill, really. It reasserts the governor's control over the National Guard when it comes to deploying these troops into foreign combat zones. And the law would be very simple. If there is a declaration of war, then the governor has full authority to authorize the Guard to, be deployed and be involved in that war. If there is no actual declaration of war by Congress, then National Guard troops cannot participate in any combat operations overseas. And this is really significant because from what I've read, if you look at the Afghanistan and Iraq wars, about 40% of the troops that were deployed in both of those wars were National Guard troops. So we're talking a significant manpower issue for the federal government, for the Pentagon. If the governors start saying, you know what, we're not going to deploy our troops because there's no declaration of war, maybe if nothing else, that will at least force Congress to do its damn job and declare war, have the debate, and be on record. Because what's happened is the Congress has basically passed their responsibility off to the president. And, in effect, they've amended the Constitution on their own, just on their own whim. And you know why they've done it? Because they don't want to have to go back to their constituents and, really be on the record for or against these wars. I think if they had to, a lot of them probably wouldn't get elected again. So they passed the buck to the president. They let the president take the heat. And, here we are today with wars going on all over the world, basically, that the United States is involved in unconstitutionally. So we're really excited about this Defend the Guard bill. And like I said, McGeehan's been introducing this in West Virginia since 2016. But last year something happened that gave it a little bit of momentum. He was able to do some parliamentary maneuvering to actually get the bill out onto the House floor. And it was eventually killed by leadership, but it gave it a little bit of attention, gave the thing a little bit of momentum. Other people took notice of it. And the goal this year is to have this bill introduced in at least 20 state legislatures for the 2020 legislative sessions, which will begin kicking off in January. This is a reasonable goal. We've already had it pre-filed in 2 states, South Carolina and Oklahoma. Of course, McGeehan will introduce it again. We have firm commitments from legislators in Wyoming. So, we're already up to 5. And McGeehan has been just a champ in aggressively reaching out to his fellow legislators across the country and saying, look, this is something that needs to be done. We need to take control of our National Guard troops. We need to take control of the war situation, force Congress to do its job, and maybe we can rein this thing in and quit sending our young men and women out to die in senseless wars in foreign lands. So, like I said, a lot of momentum, and with the number of states that will likely be introducing this, I really think we're going to, if nothing else, we're going to be able to create the conversation. People are going to take notice about this. The Pentagon's going to freak out, which will become kind of fun to watch. And, we'll get to hear the threats of we're going to pull your funding and all of the other things that come along with challenging the federal authority. But extremely important thing that's going on, and we're really pumped about it. I think this is probably the most significant thing that we're going to be working on this year.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I just wanted to highlight as a part of you said that it would only allow National Guard troops to be deployed when there's a declaration of war. I mean, something that I probably concede a little bit too much on the show is that we haven't had a declaration of war since World War II. Now, there have been authorizations for use of military force. 2001, the one to fight the Taliban and Al Qaeda. 2002 to fight Saddam Hussein in Iraq. But certainly, if you just read those, you wouldn't think that either of them would be, applicable at all today. I mean, the Taliban were displaced from Kabul. Osama bin Laden's been dead for, almost 8 years now.
Right.
Saddam's been dead for about 13 or 14. And so, but yet we're fighting wars in at least bombed 7 different countries under Obama, 7 different countries under Trump. And if you actually look at it, we're in Syria, we're kind of fighting 2 wars, one against Assad, one against his enemies in ISIS. In Yemen, fighting against the Houthis and fighting in their enemies in Al Qaeda and the Arabian Peninsula. So, and then we're flying like our drone operations to bomb ISIS in Libya out of Nigeria. So who knows, what other activities we have going on in different countries out there in West Africa. And, just so to understand the impact of this is that this would say that the National Guard cannot be used in any of these interventions.
Exactly.
That seems really huge to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to make the distinction between a vague, open-ended authorization to use force and an actual declaration of war. And there is actually a legal difference in these two things. A declaration of war has to be very specific. In essence, and if you look at what the founding fathers said when they were laying out war powers, Congress was supposed to decide when, how, where, and for how long. Basically, all along the way, Congress makes the decision. The president just executes the will of Congress. An authorization to use force flips that on its head. It basically says, okay, president, we're going to let you decide if you want to use force in this area. So they're basically delegating their decision-making responsibility to the president. It flips the war powers on its head. Like I said, it effectively amends the Constitution. An authorization to use force is not the same thing as a specific declaration of war. So under these AUMFs, none of this would be going on for the National Guard, at least, if we had these bills in place, because they're not actual not actual declarations of war. And you can see how these AUMFs are abused. I mean, the one for the war in Afghanistan, that's what they're using to justify the war in Syria. Well, the last time I checked, Afghanistan and Syria are 2 different places, and in fact, we've actually used that justification to fight the people who would be the enemies of Al Qaeda. So, the insanity of our foreign policy aside, none of this is authorized by the Constitution. And, I'm not really one to make a big deal about in terms of our liberties and freedoms about the Constitution, but it is, after all, supposed to be the playbook by which the United States government is run, and it can't even run on its own playbook, right? So, if nothing else, at least we should make them play by their own rules, I think.
Yeah, no, that's an important point. Another thing, I guess, is that, by deploying, because you mentioned how heavily they rely on the National Guard in all these foreign wars. So you would really think that there would have to be some tough decisions made, especially now since there's like bigger pushes to have, people go on less tours of duty, understanding more and more how the PTSD effects is even worse in multiple tours and all that. So maybe they would actually have to start looking at scaling back. They certainly couldn't pull off like another Iraq or Afghanistan surge. No. But at the same time, and not that I like deploying the National Guard troops anywhere, in the U.S. really, especially not like a Ferguson situation. But let's say, after Hurricane Katrina or fighting some of these wildfires, there is a large amount of manpower here, very fit, very able-bodied people who could definitely, fill sandbags and kind of help organize, set up relief stations and stuff like that, which kind of is the purpose and how the National Guard, I think, if it is to be used, should be used. But rather, they're stripping all this manpower, all this state money away, and sending it overseas to fight those wars.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You mentioned Katrina. I mean, it's a known fact that they had to pull in National Guard units from other states into Louisiana because big chunks of the Louisiana National Guard were off fighting in Iraq. So, yeah, I mean, this is not just a theoretical kind of thing. And, the state militia was really supposed to be the home defense, the defense of the state. There's only 3 reasons constitutionally that the state militia should be federalized, and that's to repel an invasion, to suppress an insurrection, or to enforce the laws of the Union. All the rest of the duties of the militia are within the parameters of what the state governors want to do and how they want to use them for the defense of the state. So, yeah, exactly. There is very definite connection between the National Guard and militia. Now, it was very much of a different conception back in the time that the Constitution was ratified, but nevertheless, the act that created the National Guard depends on the militia clauses in the Constitution. So the state militia is the National Guard, at least in terms of the law. So, they never were intended to be sent off into all these foreign conflicts and foreign wars and empire building. And of course, the United States was never supposed to be that way in the first place. Military was intended to be for the defense of the homeland. And I guess since our freedoms ran away to Afghanistan and Yemen, we have to send our boys over there to fight. I don't know.
I mean, one thing that's kind of amazing about this is you had just under 3,000 people die on 9/11, and what kind of rallying and everything the Bush administration and the neocons got the American people to do. Well, like 1,800 people died in Katrina. So it seems so amazing to me that you don't have because I guess they're not mobilizing the fear and everything. You didn't have quite the reaction and, we had to make all these big decisions and changes. But just that was a real catastrophe. And, pointing out that the National Guard troops weren't there, I would hope, especially in a more mainstream, I know maybe in the libertarian circles, this isn't the best point, but if you're a state legislator, that seems like a real point you can make, to make some headway with. One of the things that I want to take this to is I feel like every time we've talked about this, this is something that's gaining momentum. And so first of all, that's really exciting to see. And then I just want to kind of compare all the effort. I mean, unfortunately, it seems kind of small. It seems like the 10th Amendment setter, and then you mentioned Pat McGeehan, but there's not a whole lot of people working on this. I mean, you had a large part of the progressive, the good anti-war progressive movement, put a lot of focus and fight into the 2020 National Defense Authorization Act. Mm-hmm. And actually, the House version of that bill wasn't terrible. It did things like prevented the, low yield nuclear weapons from being deployed. Right. It would have ended support for Saudi Arabia in the war in Yemen. It would have created some provisions that may have eventually repealed the 2001-2002 AUMF. And all that gets stripped out during conference committee. Yeah. So I don't know. I maybe just want to talk a little bit more about all the success in spreading the message with this. And I've also seen this new group, Bring Our Troops Home.us, taking up this issue, which is a great group of conservative, I don't know about if they would call themselves anti-war, but certainly interventionist, weary Republicans.
Yes, and they had a big conference
too.
Yeah,
sorry,
exactly. They had a big conference in Washington, D.C. just about a month or two ago, and they actually had a panel discussion on the Defend the Guard bill. So this is something that they are pushing, and it's good to see. I think this is something that can have widespread bipartisan support, because I think America in general is getting war weary. And again, emphasizing what we've learned, not us, because we already knew this, but what the general public has learned through these, the release of these papers. I think there's a little bit of a fertile field, I guess is the best term to use for this type of action right now. And before I forget about it, I want to let people know how they can help, how they can get involved in this and actually take 5 or 10 minutes out of your day and help move this forward. Because really at its core, it's a grassroots thing. That's what you alluded to. It's groups of people who believe passionately in ending the wars and reining in all of the foreign intervention, who are working together to push this, and supporting what Pat's doing. And you can be involved in that. All you have to do, I'll give you a link, Colin. You can put it on the show notes page, but you can also go over to blog.10thamendmentcenter.com, and we have a letter on the website that Pat McGeehan has written to state legislators urging them to introduce this piece of legislation. And he's actually sent it out to like over 5,000 state legislators across the country. But one thing that we can do is we can take that letter and we can send it to our individual state representative and state senator with a quick email saying, hey, I'd like for you to check out this letter, consider introducing this bill. Let folks know that you support the Defend the Guard Act. If we do that, we may well get it introduced into a whole lot more states. I cannot emphasize enough how significant it is for a state legislator to get a letter from a constituent or an email urging them to take action on a specific issue. They're not used to it. It's not like calling Congress. Calling Congress is like banging your head against a brick wall. You talk to an intern and you get an email 3 weeks later that may or may not correlate with whatever you called about. State legislator offices are much different. You are more likely to be able to talk to that legislator. You are much more likely to make an impact by sending an email urging them to do this. Like I said, 5 or 10 minutes, look up your state reps, your state senator, state representative, download the email, attach it to your email, send it off to them, and encourage them to introduce this legislation. I think that's one way that you can very quickly have an impact and possibly get this introduced in your own state. So, something that I really, really want to encourage people to do.
Yeah, well, I'm sure this thing can make a difference. I actually sent my state legislator, I just sent him something yesterday because they introduced some anti-BDS legislation in my state. So I sent my guy a letter saying, hey, you gotta support, fight against this First Amendment violation. But, now I'm gonna send him another one with this information as well. And it seems to me like it should be a political win. I understand why the more federally connected people at the state level are going to cry about, oh, we could lose federal funds, and that kind of thing. But, these are state National Guard troops. These aren't federal troops. And from my understanding, they should be answerable to their own governors, not Donald Trump. And,
right.
And you would think that may be I'm in a pretty liberal state. Do you want the troops answerable to Trump or do you want them answerable to your governor?
Exactly. And, really, and I can't emphasize this enough. All we're asking is for wars to be conducted in the way the Constitution designed the system to work. That's all we're doing. We're not saying that the National Guard troops can't be deployed. We're not, putting national security at risk or anything like that. We're simply saying that if we're going to be in a war, do it like we're supposed to do it. Congress declares war. They have the debate. They have the discussion. They direct the parameters of the war, and then the president executes it. That's all we're asking. So it's hard to say, well, I oppose following the Constitution when it comes to war. Okay, well, yeah, make that argument. You sound like an idiot.
So, unless you have anything else on this Defend the Guard stuff, I'm always interested in what's going on at the 10th Amendment Center. Because, I'm pretty focused outward usually. I mean, sometimes I watch a video of a cop pushing some little kid up against the locker in the wall, like, right. He's still a high school bully or something like that, and ends up, I think they charged him with a misdemeanor today. And that gets my blood boiling. That gets me into some local news a little bit more. But I'm really glad that you, guys over at the 10th Amendment Center are there watching my back and, making sure that when I'm traveling down the road, a road pirate doesn't get to pull me over and tape my car. And I know there's a lot of work going on with civil asset forfeiture. In fact, there was a Supreme Court ruling recently that got a lot of attention. I didn't look closely enough at that, but the headlines that I read kind of summarized it as it was a huge victory for civil asset forfeiture opponents.
Yeah, a huge victory if you consider centralizing power in the federal courts a victory. It really wasn't that big of a deal at all. It basically all it did was it gave the federal courts the power to determine whether or not an asset forfeiture violates the Eighth Amendment and the excessive fines, excessive punishment clause. So it didn't really change anything. Now it's just something that can be a federal issue. So now the federal courts are going to get to decide whether or not a given asset forfeiture case exceeds what would be, considered reasonable in terms of not being excessive. Now, you can take your chance with the federal courts if you want to. Historically, that's not worked out real well for the people who care about liberty. Federal courts tend to defer to cops, and they tend to defer to government agencies. And I have a feeling that they're going to say it's perfectly fine to take somebody's car because they're dealing drugs, and that's not excessive at all. So, and then when that happens, because it's the federal courts, then that makes it the law of the entire United States. So I'm generally wary of anything that the Supreme Court does because it centralizes authority in Washington, D.C., and generally gives them more power, not less. And I think that's overall typically a loss for liberty, even though you may get a win here and there for an individual issue. I think it's far more important to tackle the asset forfeiture issue at the state and local level, where most of the forfeiture is going on in the first place. Instead of relying on a federal court to maybe or maybe not decide what is or is not excessive, I think it would be better just to rein in the whole asset forfeiture system to begin with. And so we're seeing a lot of states do that. There's a very strong movement to require criminal convictions before there is any type of forfeiture action. To me, that's common sense. I can't even believe that that's an issue, that it's at least a bit controversial. Of course, the only reason it is controversial is because the police departments use these asset forfeiture laws as a way to fund their departments. They don't call it policing for profit for nothing. But one of the things that I think is really, really important, and we're beginning to see some states take steps on, is separating themselves from the federal asset forfeiture system. And if you'll indulge me for just a second, I'll kind of explain that there's actually a two-tier asset forfeiture system in the United States. You have your state and local asset forfeiture, which runs via state law, and then you have the federal asset forfeiture laws. Now, federal asset forfeiture has this thing that's attached to it that's called equitable sharing. And in essence, what happens is state and local police can pass cases off to the federal government. The federal government tries them under federal law instead of state law, and then they give the proceeds of the forfeiture up to 80% back to the state and local law enforcements. So it's a way for the state police to get money without actually having to do the work. It also allows police in states that have strict asset forfeiture laws that require convictions, that make it difficult for police to take people's stuff. And there are a number of states that have decent asset forfeiture laws. California, Missouri are among those. What happens in these states is that police just say, okay, fine, we won't do this state forfeiture process. We'll give it to the feds, and we'll let the feds do it, and then we'll collect 80% of the revenue and put it in our coffers and buy really cool police cars. So what we're seeing happen in a lot of states is they are prohibiting the transfer of these cases under most circumstances. Basically, what they're doing is they're opting out of the equitable sharing program. Police hate it because it gets rid of their cash cow, but it is a way to get the state out of the asset forfeiture system. It's not even an issue anymore. And then you don't have to worry about whether or not the federal court's going to decide if something is excessive or isn't. Because like I said, I do not trust the courts to protect my rights. So I mentioned Missouri. Missouri has pretty good state asset forfeiture laws, surprisingly. It's not easy to take people's stuff there. But you see a lot of cases that are passed off to the federal government in Missouri. So there was just a bill introduced recently or pre-filed for the next session that would cut that link between state and local law enforcement and the federal equitable sharing program. And we hope to see more states doing this in the coming year as well.
So another thing I've been seeing in the news a lot recently, and this will actually, one of these stories will be in my news roundup today that you can find on the homepage of the Libertarian Institute. But this one deals with all these laws that are being passed more at like county level, sometimes at state levels, that are either not requiring sheriffs to enforce federal gun laws or not requiring local sheriffs to enforce state gun laws. The article I saw focused on Washington State. Looked like some kind of good news to me that at least 50% of the state sheriffs seem to be saying they're not going to enforce the law that clearly violates the Second Amendment there. it's important for the people to be able to, own guns. And, that's something that we need to keep in this country. And so the sheriffs standing up seems to be a generally good thing. And one of the things I want to bring this up for is because I don't know if this would be something that sheriffs even feel empowered to, if it wasn't, for people like the 10th Amendment Center and Chris Ann Hall, going around the country and explaining to sheriffs, these are your rights. This is the 10th Amendment. These are the kind of things that you could do to oppose these laws in your own states and counties.
Yeah, also Sheriff Mack at the Constitutional Sheriffs Association. I think it's called COSPA or CISPA. Or, can't remember the acronym. But yeah, there's been a strong movement to empower sheriffs to live up to their oath. Sheriffs are constitutional officers. They're elected by the people, and they swear an oath to defend and uphold the Constitution of the United States. And so there is a strong movement to encourage sheriffs to do just that and to refuse to enforce unconstitutional laws. I have mixed feelings about what's going on with the so-called gun sanctuary counties that we're seeing springing up. The idea is fantastic, and ultimately it comes down to the decision of the sheriff in that county. If the sheriff decides he's not going to enforce, he has every right to do that. He's answerable ultimately to the people of the state. But what we're seeing with these sanctuary counties, a lot of them are passing resolutions. And the problem with this is resolutions in almost every state are non-binding. So they don't really require anybody to do anything. So they can say, we're a gun sanctuary county and we're not enforcing federal gun control, but it's not binding. If the sheriff changes his mind or if a local police chief changes his mind, he can go ahead and enforce it. There's no consequence because there's no legally binding statute that keeps him from doing that. The step that they really need to take is to pass county ordinances that prohibit the enforcement of federal gun control. That's something that they can do. It's legally binding. They can put penalties on it, and it would be much more meaningful. I feel like in some of these cases that it's window dressing and rhetoric, and when push comes to shove, it may not end up having the teeth that we hope that it would. So very important to look at. Is it a resolution or is it an actual ordinance? What we really want to see passed are ordinances. Now, that said, I think it's a good thing that it's even being talked about, that there is this growing attitude of resistance. And like I said, the sheriff is answerable to the people of his county. He doesn't need, a resolution or ordinance to decide that his office is not going to enforce, a given law. I also feel like I should explain there is a difference between a county resisting a state law and a state or a county resisting a federal law. In most cases, from a legal standpoint, the state has full control over counties. They can pull funding. They can fire people. They could, I guess, conceivably arrest state officers who refuse to enforce state laws. On the other hand, the federal government does not have the power to force a state or a locality to enforce a federal law because the state has sovereignty. A county is not sovereign. A county is a political subdivision of the state. So there's some legal difference there. But again, the real key is, are people willing to stand up and say no? I mean, ultimately, nullification starts with the individual. It's laws and ordinances and resolutions and all those things can be helpful. State laws can certainly be helpful when they prohibit enforcement of certain federal acts, but ultimately it's up to people. Marijuana prohibition has been nullified primarily because people want to smoke weed. And, if we're going to nullify gun control, it's ultimately going to come down to people are not willing to give up their firearms, that they're just going to say no. And, the more sheriffs that are willing to say no and follow through on that, not enforce it, it's going to create a great deal of trouble for these politicians. They're already having to resort to, we're going to call up the National Guard, which, on a side note, I think, illustrates the myth of this idea that these gun control people want to end gun violence, because they're more than happy to perpetrate gun violence in order to take your guns away from you. So, just a little side thing that I find a little bit ironic and hypocritical. But
it definitely. I mean, the gun violence committed by the state far exceeds the gun violence committed by us civilians against each other. Absolutely. And I don't think I even have to count all the shooting that we do of people overseas. to
Right.
really to make that the case. Just the number of people that, between our cops and federal law enforcement agencies, kill people at, they do quite a bit of damage, especially when you look at a huge number of the fatalities of civilians at the hands of guns is at our own hand. And, many times because of the wars and other things that the state made us fight. So,
Yeah.
I think that's, just the most important point about, the whole framing of the issue is, taking away guns. Well, no, you're empowering the state with all their guns,
Exactly.
and they're far more likely to use them against a whole bunch of innocent people than anyone else.
Absolutely. And, just to sum up that whole thing, like I said, I think there are some things we should be wary of as we see this movement push forward. There's a part of me that's a little bit worried that it's going to be window dressing and rhetoric over reality. But that said, the spirit that we're seeing bubble up, the spirit of resistance, the spirit of a willingness to protect our liberties, I think that is a good thing. And if we can channel those into the right directions, into action, into refusal to cooperate, then I think that we can face down these many tyrants who want to lord over us, because ultimately, without our cooperation, they can't rule over us. That's the reality. And so I'm excited to see that bubbling up. We've been talking about it for years at the 10th Amendment Center. Nullify, say no. The Rosa Parks method, refuse to give up your seat on the bus. That's where our power lies. They need our cooperation, and without it, they're going to have a hard time enforcing their laws. So I say more power to these people, and hopefully we can direct them to channel this energy into ways that are productive and that will have real impact.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming back on the show. I'm definitely going to keep an eye on this over at the 10th Amendment Center, as well as sending a letter myself to my state senator and representative this week. But I just wanted to ask, is there anything else? Do you have like an end of the year thing going on 10th Amendment Center for fundraising, or where do people go to donate to you personally? Because the work you are doing and the 10th Amendment Center is doing is critical, to keeping this a free and prosperous and hopefully less violent nation.
Yeah. So to support the 10th Amendment Center, we have a membership program. You can be a member for as little as like $2 a month. You can go to store.10thamendmentcenter.com to check out the membership program. There are perks to being a member. You have access to free downloads, ebooks, things like that. As a member, you get first dibs and exclusive premieres of different things. And so, being a member is cool. Who doesn't want to be a member of the 10th Amendment Center, right? And $2 a month, like I said. We've decided that instead of trying to, squeeze a bunch of money out of a few people, we'll squeeze a few bucks out of a bunch of people and keep the doors open and keep the work going that we're doing. So I would definitely appreciate any help as far as that goes. And if nothing else, check out what we're doing. Keep up what we're doing over at 10thamendmentcenter.com. Watch for bills that are introduced in your own state. And when you see bills that are worth supporting, take that few minutes to contact your state legislators and let them know you support those bills and help us get those things passed. Personally, you can check out my website at michaelmaharrey.com. And I do have a Patreon. I have a side project called Godarchy, which is it deals more with Christianity in the state. It's kind of a Christian voluntarist worldview. You could check that out, godarchy.org. And I have a Patreon at patreon.com/godarchy if anybody is interested in supporting me personally. Of course, I would appreciate that. But if you're going to do one or two things, support the 10th Amendment Center first, because that's really where the work is getting done.
All right. I mean, over at the 10th Amendment Center, just for you only anti-war people, or, if guns really aren't your thing, you and Michael Bolden are both great on the war issue. And I'm actually going as well linked to an episode on the show notes page of the Scott Horton Show, where Scott and Michael Bolden have a conversation a little bit similar to the one we had here. So you could check that out if you want. But just to know that if you're giving money to the 10th Amendment Center, you're giving it to people who are, very good, principled, anti-war and good on these issues. So,
yeah, absolutely. And, the side issues that come with war, we're very much involved in dealing with: surveillance, police militarization, the side effects of war that trickle down into our domestic life. Those things need to be fought as well. It's part of the broader anti-war movement, I think. And we're really heavily involved in dealing with the surveillance state. Like I said, police militarization. We've worked up some legislation that deals with torture at the state and local level. So definitely a lot of things for folks that's foreign policy, anti-war is your thing. You have a friend in the 10th Amendment Center, and we are working to fight right alongside you.
All right. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, buddy.